In the modern era, I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that superheroes are our modern mythology. There have been so many different retellings and revamps of these beloved characters who have been with us for like 70, 80 plus years. These guys have been around for a long time and enough to completely change the cultural zeitgeist, right? We know even from a casual level how the world has been impacted by superheroes, and the only way they were able to maintain their longevity was by changing it up every couple of years. If we look at the American comic book industry, you could tell that it is separated into distinct ages. And if we're going to, say, apply a character, let's use Superman, right? The golden age of comics, he started off as a very street-level character. He didn't have all of his powers, and he was mostly working through this tagline called the champion of the oppressed. In the Silver Age, it became a lot more zany, a lot more wacky, and a lot more, I would say, creative. A lot of Superman's more important science fiction aspects came from this era, whether we're talking about like Supergirl coming from Krypton, or like actually implementing kryptonite, to Brainiac, to like Bizarro in the Bizarro world. All of that came from here. And then we go on to the Bronze Age. In the Bronze Age, what's most important about this is that we saw it slowly but surely develop more maturity. The characterization and the character drama and the connections between our main character and their supporting cast and the villains were central to this era. And then it led into something called the Dark Age of Comics. And the reason why that is because of a little thing that we're going to talk about today that really revolutionized the comic book industry for the better, and at times, depending on who you're talking to, for the worst, and that is deconstruction. Now, what is deconstruction? Deconstruction in the most simple terms is when you take a story, let's say the superhero myth, and from there it asks, what would this really look like in the real world? For the longest time, superhero comics are just like, look at this cool superhero and supervillain, good versus evil. There isn't any gray here. Hope versus, I guess, despair. And from the late 1980s and going on to the 90s, we saw that there was a rippling effect here. A handful of the work that was being done was kind of like a scalpel that was used to analyze the genre, right? Look at the interrogation here from the power perspective, the responsibility, the myth, and how like the human cost of living in a landscape of like gods and humans, what does that do to you? And the results of these experiments from a bunch of creators led to a rewiring of the industry itself, and altered for the future how creators decided to tell their own stories. And it left a little bit of a mixed bag, but a lot of things were inspired by this period of comics. The cultural trends that this changed really expanded further than the medium itself, right? It started to reach into movies, television, of course the adaptations that happened. But while I'm not going to go too far into that detail, this was huge just for American literature, in my opinion. Of course, there are going to be some people that think that comic books in general don't have much of an impact, but I'm telling you, it does, especially considering how dominant superhero media is even to this day. To break it down even further, let's take Batman, one of my favorite heroes. A normal superhero story will say Batman is a cool character. He fights crime, he saves Gotham, right? That's something that you would see in like a Lego Batman game, nothing that really criticizes the Dark Knight. If we look at a deconstruction, it asks what kind of person dresses up as a bat to fight crime, and from there we can kind of extrapolate a bit. Is he really helping Gotham, or is he just feeding into his obsession? Now, we all know that he really is helping Gotham, but these are the questions that lead to very interesting discussions and to, honestly, very captivating storytelling. And even to this day, it leads to some of the most interesting comic book debates ever, because Batman is probably the most psychoanalyzed character there is. If you love him, if you hate him, one thing that you could say about him is that every single time there's any sort of crazy discussion about him that doesn't have to do anything with power scaling, it leads to really cool ethical debates that we would never see with any other characters. Getting people to think is what makes deconstruction so special, and why Batman was one of the few characters to start this off. But before we get started, I want to lay a little bit of some ground rules. We're going to talk about 4 unique stories and how each of them really changed comic books forever. And the last 2, I don't want to spoil too much. I'm going to spoil some things, but the last 2 I really want you guys to read on your own, because they are masterpieces in my opinion, and for me to spoil them, it would be crazy. The first two, I'm not saying they're any less good, I'm just saying most people have likely read it, or have at least seen the adaptations. Let me know what you guys think of these stories down below, and let's go through each of the books in chronological order, starting with Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. Now, despite what the naysayers might say, this story is actually really cool and really good. I know that sounds like something that everybody will agree on, but a lot of people on social media tend to say that this story sucks because of what it did to the Batman going forward. And yes, it has led to very poor imitations of this work that ended up making everything a lot more grimdark, but the contributions that this one story did to the Batman mythos should not go understated. Most of it, if not all of it, is really well done. The dialogue in this book is so, well, dude, I'm telling you guys, I reread this book and I forgot how good it really is, because every year I just watch the animated movie because that's also really good. But the thing about this story and what makes this dissection different from every single one that I will talk about is that unlike the others, what Miller did here is he took one single icon, one that is very familiar and honestly at this point very mythic, and that was Batman Bruce Wayne, and then you force the world itself to reckon with the fact that heroes have a certain age, right? They have an age in terms of course, their literal physical age, but also in terms of when they're the most prevalent, when they're at their prime. And then they come and go. In history, it just has to move on. That's how you have to understand the shock value of The Dark Knight Returns, because from the real world perspective, taking a bit of a step back, look at the 1960s and 70s, right? He's been through his campy era. He's been through the stuff with 1966 Adam West, which I love that show. Watch it again, guys. It is a complete fever dream, I'm telling you. Put it on the background. I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun. But the show itself really followed that silver age of comics. The tone itself was frequently very light, and the continuity itself was rubbery. Miller came in to give it more of a structure, of course something that he really did when he created Batman Year One, but the building blocks really started here with DKR. His vision yanked Batman more into the grim, urban, dark noir type of setting. That's where his stories went to. Of course, the Bronze Age of comics and Denny O'Neil is where Batman really started getting more serious and dark, but this one dialed it up to 11, but to a way that felt natural and something that complemented the story, not something for the sake of just doing so. And from here, he revealed a lot of uncomfortable assumptions that we had about superheroes. The reconstruction itself felt very visceral and like theatrical, right? If you took The Dark Knight Returns and applied it to a film, that would probably win so many awards. The Dark Knight Returns animated movie was really good, but honestly, it's really hard to get internal monologue to be a part of a film unless you have it in pretty short bursts. Even The Batman by Matt Reeves, it only had it in very key sections in the beginning, the end, and I'm pretty sure a little bit in the middle, but he opens up his first appearance as Batman once again through an older Bruce Wayne putting on the suit again. This is one of the first old man stories. This is of course something that would become really popular in the mainstream thanks to Logan through the movie. But here we see a body, his body, creaking under the strain of a lifetime of violence. The premise here is that Batman is returning to a city that has become a lot more apathetic and corrupt, something that we never thought would possibly happen in a lifetime. How would Gotham actually be worse without the criminals that flood the streets in the modern era? It turns that eternal hero trope on its head. Instead of a perpetually pristine character who's going out and fighting crime every day and never really getting older, the Miller version of Batman is a man driven by pain, by ritual, and by obsession. It's not like he's reinventing the wheel completely, but he's putting more emphasis on it so that even the least seasoned reader would understand exactly what he's going for. While the book itself is filled with subtlety, sometimes you just gotta beat your viewer over the head so they understand where you're going. His fights are very ferocious, but his internal monologue is just as aggressive, and one of the most evocative sequences in my opinion was a confrontation of the mutants, a mutant gang that took over the city, who was kind of the fill-in for all of the rogues gallery, and they turned Gotham into their domain, and the fight here is very brutal. But it's not just a superhero street-level brawl that we are used to. Batman is very joyless in his violence. Of course, in the 1960s, who would beat somebody up and make a joke, because that's all it ever was. They didn't really show that much violence, but it becomes more raw once you show it through a more realistic setting. And it's presented, the fight here, as both necessary, but also it can be potentially corrosive. We look at the heroic conflict here, it becomes a political spectacle. There's televised debates throughout the entire story where we see Batman either propaganda for his side or against him, negative anti-Batman propaganda all the time because of his return. And the eventual governmental manipulation of Superman are all Miller's way of showing that superheroes themselves are not just mythic beings, but they can be actors within a political system. If we look at something like John Byrne's Superman, especially the very beginning of his run and how pro-American it is, I'm not saying there's something wrong with being patriotic, but the fact that they completely changed his character, I'm telling you, Bronze Age Superman and early post-crisis Superman are completely night and day in terms of how politically to the right this man is leading. It's actually mind-boggling, and even though the story came after DKR, you could still tell its influence, the influence and the foresight it had to predict where the superhero genre was going with their storytelling. The fight between Batman and Superman here isn't just a mere punch-out. The really cool thing about it is that it is a clash of American ideals. On one hand, it's very militarized individualism. On the other side, it's state-sanctioned order. Unfortunately, if you look at purely from a Superman fan standpoint, he opted to have Superman as an instrument of government policy, whereas Batman remained the stubborn anomaly that he'll always be portrayed to be after this storyline. He rejects all of this control, and that tension here really reconfigured the Batman itself in the public's imagination. Miller's influence cannot be understated, from how he's portrayed in Tim Burton to the Dark Knight trilogy. How vigilantism is completely looked at from a more, intellectual perspective, and of course the more brooding, introspective character that he made Batman become. Honestly, through an aesthetic and a writing perspective, he is the backbone for a lot of it. The tonal language of Batman has been shaped by this one man, and this has kind of led to a bit of a double-edged sword. There is some positives and there is some negatives, but the depth and the context is what makes Miller's work resonate with a lot of us, even to this day. If The Dark Knight Returns is a critique on a single character, The Watchmen is a complete critique on just superheroes in general, the mythos itself, right? This is the deconstruction that every other deconstruction has to answer to. This is the top dog. And to discuss any of this fairly, you have to know the origin of this. Moore originally pitched all of this as a story using the Charlton characters, or Charlton characters, however you want to pronounce it. I know somebody in the comments is on my These characters, if you don't know, if you watch Peacemaker, well, Peacemaker is one of those. Blue Beetle, The Question, Nightshade, Captain Atom, and Judo Master, right? These are characters from that imprint, that publisher, and eventually DC bought them over and Alan Moore wanted to use them. They were forgotten, but they're more of pulpy-oriented heroes, so you could do a lot of that. Batman was one of, if not their most famous characters, so you know there was some money to be made. And DC was kind of nervous about the explicitness and the crazy risks that Moore was doing with his vision, right? You don't want to ruin your new toys right off the bat, because they could probably implement those characters into the DC universe and have some really cool dynamics. If we look at Blue Beetle and Booster Gold, that was a really good idea, and I'm thankful that they did not do any of that, because you cannot walk back the events of Watchmen. So they asked him to write analogs instead, so this of course created something called the Watchmen, which of course was a critique on certain heroic types, because these characters are modeled after the former archetypes, and also had an argument about storytelling itself. It uses basically every trick in the book to form a comic. Non-linear storytelling structure, a lot of interstitial text, is that the right word? It's when there's the pirate story or the crazy comic within a comic section in the book that was taken out of the movie, but if you know, you know. And then also, of course, the fabricated historical documents and the patchwork of POVs, right? Dr. Manhattan, Rorschach, and the lot, to make the reader really construct or reconstruct what heroism really looks like when you have the full view. There's so many pieces going on, but it makes sense. At the core of all of that, it dismantles the myth that power reliably produces virtue. That is not always the case. Obviously, we know things of supervillains and superheroes. We know that power, absolute power, can corrupt absolutely, but it wasn't always as murky. take Moore's Dr. Manhattan. He is the literal embodiment of this question. After he became basically an omnipotent being, he doesn't become a moral paragon. Even like somebody like Captain Atom, he does become a lot more jaded through his book series after this gets published. But in general, if you compare the two from what they were at the publication of Watchmen, you can see how much more depth John had. He becomes estranged, he removes himself from human time, and he chooses to live on Mars. He demonstrates how power itself can erode empathy when a person can manipulate outcomes with like a flick of a wrist or just the sparks of his thoughts. He can do all of this, and especially when you can see the ugliness of humanity. Do they really deserve saving? Should I take a step back? Then of course the vigilante aspect of justice, it's not automatically justified. Rorschach in his very moral, absolutism, yes, is very positioned as, he's kind of like fanatic, right? He's a hero who will not compromise, and while that would be good if he was a paragon like Superman, it's not exactly the greatest when you're a character with the mental state of Rorschach. That man is mental. And a lot of audience members just let it go because it's so cool, but the refusal of this leads to collateral damage. And of course the final twist with Ozymandias, the plot's climax, the instrument of tyrannical solutions, he leads to mass murder, and he stages that as a way to prevent nuclear annihilation because there was a nuclear arms race, and the world itself wanted to see who was going to launch that nuclear code first. And it forces the readers themselves to ask whether the classic superhero choices, sacrifice a few to save many, is ethically defensible or simply monstrous in practice. Of course, this takes the most crazy logic and situation leap of all time, but it's not exactly far off when you think about the decisions that heroes have to make on a daily basis. And also, the public support of heroes because they are noble. That idea more shows that heroes are media icons, political tools, and sometimes they are state-sponsored and they have ugly secrets, something that gets expanded upon more to either great or middling success depending on who you talk to in The Boys, that entire comic series, and of course the much better superhero television show. The method that Moore uses here is very patient, I think, as we see Moore puts all of these pieces together, from the patchwork of documents to like the press coverage of these heroes to the sanitized way the public sees certain things to the messy private life. We look at like the comedian to what's her name, Silk Spectre, and even Night Owl, to the intimate and very unsettling journal entries of Rorschach himself. All of these choices are to force readers to think and to pull things together. It's a real-world investigation right before our eyes. I love when writers get us to think, and the climax going right back to it. This was an emotional and moral experiment laid bare. Is this the right thing to do? Did he save the world by dropping that fake alien attack to make all of the world come together and fight off this threat? Was that the best decision that he made, considering that he literally did 9/11 times 20,000 on the entirety of New York? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is a hero? It demands the readers themselves to ask this question. Is it still heroic when the moral calculus of all of this requires mass death? It's mature, mainstream storytelling that wasn't even seen to be possible back then, but now it's common fiddle. In short, Watchmen itself taught comics how to grow, but on the other side, it's very easy to see how the cultural lessons here can be simplified into style without substance when you try to copy it. And now we come to the one story that I don't want to spoil that much of, but I'm going to have to a little bit. You all need to read it. I'm pretty sure in the intro I did say 2 stories. It's just this one, and that is Astro City by Kurt Busiek. This story is criminally underrated, which you wouldn't think of considering that it has Alex Ross covers. This man is a god when it comes to art, but unlike Miracle Man and all the things created by Moore and Miller that kind of terrified us of the consequences of power, Busiek decided to go a bit deeper. Instead of fully folding into that brutality and cynicism of the Dark Age, because this is published in the direct middle of it, this is during like 1995, 1996, it decided to go a little bit deeper. It interrogated all of these myths without having to go down to that level. It deconstructed superheroes by humanizing them. If we're going to take some of these ideas here, right, Busiek asked, what would it be like to live next door to these gods? to see them like fly across the sky every day on your way to work. That is so simple, but also something rarely talked about. Think of your favorite superhero movie and think about all the background extras that need to go into every single scene when you're outside. Imagine that, but then following the perspective and really delving into what these people on the ground really feel. And by proxy, it makes the stories feel smaller but also more personal, and often when done right, a lot more heartbreaking. They're about, let's say, a secretary who dates a superhero, but you can never quite fit within that world that feels larger than life. Think about Superman and Lois Lane. Lois Lane, despite being only a human, is larger than life. That girl is a character, and that's why we love her. She is on the level of these superheroes, and nobody's going to stop her. Her curiosity, her initiative, and overall her spunk and attitude. But think about it, you cannot fit within that world if you're a normal person. Imagine a petty crook who brushes against some sort of supervillainy, right? Now you realize the futility of trying to be a criminal. By telling these stories, Busiek is dismantling these assumptions that superhero comics always have to be about fighting each other. He found something special by exploring the ripple effects of these characters and the tropes themselves. Another standout story is from a character called the Samaritan. Imagine him being the Astro City version of Superman. He's their analog, and he saves lives across the world constantly, just like, Clark Kent. But the crux of all of this, the point of it, is that his personal life is non-existent. Something that Clark himself also had to deal with, but not to this extent, and not for as long. They didn't put as much focus as Samaritan did on the topic. In one issue, he focused on the sheer exhaustion of his existence, his desire to stop and just fly for pleasure rather than just an emergency response. He is a worldwide firefighter in effect. In this way, Busiek critiques the trope of the tireless savior by showing us all of the psychological tolls that it would take on a person. Another issue that, if I'm remembering correctly, is called The Confession, and examines the idea of a sidekick through a gothic noir-infused take. So obviously some Batman and Robin riffing here, and it reveals the manipulative and often painful relationship between a mentor and a protege. Not exactly the normal Batman and Robin take, because despite what some people might tell you on the internet, he's actually a pretty decent father. Of course, he has some bad tendencies, but nobody is perfect. But wrapping back around, he's asking how these archetypes will function in the real world. And instead of tearing everything down through the idea of cynicism, he tears it down through empathetically looking at these characters and realizing the problems that they would have in a modern, real-world setting. And that is what makes it special. The influence of the series is so profound in my opinion. It can be found, the DNA itself, in series like Mr. Miracle by Tom King, to the Marvels, his previous work with Alex Ross, where he highlighted the human perspective of everyday people in the Marvel Universe, seeing the world through the eyes of a man on the ground, to even Gotham Central, where we see the police department of Gotham feel inadequate due to Batman's workings, right? He's solving all of the crimes, but at the end of the story, why is it only the police suffering the consequences? Why do they have people men down and dying while Batman goes home? It's much more complex than that, but from their perspective, Batman's going through this without losing anything, and he gets all the credit while they're thrown at the wayside to be criticized by the people of Gotham. Granted, a lot of their people are corrupt, but I could see what it will do mentally to the actual good cops of Gotham being seen as a joke and a corrupt mess. The great thing about Astro City that all of us should actually strive to see in more of our stories is that it showed us and reminded us that even gods have fragile hearts. It's not just the destruction or the deconstruction of myth, but the exploration of its impact, its beauty, and its cost on the people in the sky and the people on the ground. And to bookend this video, let's bookend it with the story that bookended. I'm using bookend a lot. Yes, my favorite word of the segment, I guess, at this point. It is Kingdom Come. This level of deconstruction, it interrogated the superhero genre, and the genre itself, the state that it was in, was the Dark Age, the Grimdark, the stuff that was caused by these previous books. Not exactly Astro City, but Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, right? So this story had to deal with the aftermath. When comics become dominated by edgy superheroes with guns, spikes, brutality, 10 billion pockets on their body, you know what I'm talking about. Cable, get your fixing. Did somebody fix his drip yet? It's been like 20-30 years. But Kingdom Come, it responded with a very sweeping epic storyline that posed the question, what happens when the old ideals of justice and truth and the American way collide with a new generation of violent, unaccountable superhumans? And then the story pivots to an older Superman. This is in the future. Everybody is, for the most part, either retired or put in a position where they rarely, if not ever, interact with the populace. People don't even notice that these heroes are still here. Green Lantern is in a citadel, high in the sky in space where nobody can see him, coming out whenever he's needed. The Flash, Wally West, is a blur, always moving, never stopping, solving crimes before anybody could even see him. It follows the old guard coming into and confronting this chaotic world with a bunch of reckless new metahumans who've lost the sight. What is being a true superhero? They don't know what morality really is. It's lost on them. And the clash between the old guard and the new, of course, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, and this new nihilistic youth who of course embody and resemble the era itself, right? They are a gateway to a critique on the industry itself. And Mark Waid and Alex Ross, they weren't just telling a story about a superhuman civil war, which of course is the brunt of many of the action set pieces. They were commenting on the decline of heroic values in comics during the 1990s, not just because of what the writers were writing, but because of what was getting popular. Things like The Punisher, Wolverine, and Image comics like Spawn and Savage Dragon and all those things, and like Wildcats, that was what the readers were reading. And he was like, no, they decided to reinforce a message about grounding a story in relevance while having a biblical tone, showing Superman is not just a character, he is a mythological archetype standing in for everything that superheroes were supposed to embody. So here we see Superman as a pillar of the Silver and Bronze Age. But the brilliance here of Kingdom Come is that it doesn't just settle for nostalgia. Superman understands his outdated methods. Batman's authoritarian streak across all of Gotham, making sure that citizens can't go out at certain points, having whole curfews, and having Batman robots patrolling the streets, and even Wonder Woman's sudden growth to militarized tactics. In other words, I guess it kinda deconstructs both the reckless nature of these modern heroes, but it shines a light on these former ones as well, the supposedly pure icons of the Golden Age, and it holds them accountable. The impact of all of this shows that we have heroes here, DC heroes, legends, icons, who strive towards certain ideals and to not wallow in cynicism. That is what they insist, but on the same time, it honestly helped readers reflect on what superhero comics could be and what they were. Should they just be empty like grit and like violence, or meaningful inspiration? Actually, now when I think about it, it was a huge inspiration for things like Justice League Unlimited, and of course the later Justice comic also drawn by Alex Ross, where we see heroes that coexist in a world with political and ethical complexity. But what do you guys think? What is your opinion on deconstructions? Do you think there is more positive than negatives, or vice versa, right? In terms of positives, it allowed the superhero genre to grow up. Deconstruction led to people considering comics as legitimate, as a source of literature, right? Without this, none of that would happen, because they were once dismissed as very juvenile entertainment, but now they're used as analytical studies for universities, review for mainstream newspapers, and are seen in the same breath as like film and novels, and are used as the inspiration for films and novels. It completely changed the genre by giving it more complexity and nuance, and it created the craft of comics leveling up. It led to more experimentation. If you look at the artwork, the paneling, the text bubbles, the lettering, how we have our dialogue, and new subgenres really emerged out of this. If we look at anything created during the Vertigo era and all the crazy cool and just psychedelic things that they did, yes, it was something done as well in the Silver Age, but now it was completely intentional. It wasn't just all the creativity bottled up in the mind and made for children. Now some of the writers literally decided to take some drugs and start writing, and it led to some of the craziest experiences you'll ever get in any form or genre of content. The negatives, of course, that it was the rise of the grimdark as a default, the erosion of hope, right? A lot of the optimism and escapism was removed for very joyless and more extreme forms of content. I guess if you like very violent stuff without any substance, I guess you might like it. Honestly, we all do sometimes. I'm not going to try to throw shade at it because we all have moments where we want to turn our brain off. And then obviously a generation of imitators who came on the scene to completely miss the point and not interpret anything that was done here properly. Many creators just recycled these same ideas and themes endlessly without understanding what it meant. What if Superman went evil? What if Batman went too far? What if heroes were secretly fascists? These questions now felt less subversive and now more like cliches. And obviously, of course, the escalation of shock value, doing things for the sake of getting people to have some sort of reaction to it and be either surprised, negatively respond to it, or to positively say, hell yeah, let's go, this is cool, just for the sake of sensationalism to stand out, often leaving a lot of readers with little insight into what these characters could really be. But yeah, guys, what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Remember to like, subscribe, turn on post notifications so you know when a new video goes live. And yeah, see you all later. Take care. Deuces. Peace.